Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So, in this video, we are going to look at War Photographer 1985 by Carol Ann Duffy. This poem is about a photographer who goes out to war zones to take photographs for newspapers and magazines. Although it is about war, it is from the point of view of someone who is not an actual soldier or related to a soldier. It was written a few years after the Falklands War, which may explain why Duffy wrote the poem. And there we have Carol Ann Duffy. The Falklands War was between Britain and Argentina over the Falklands Islands. We don't need to go too much into the history of it, except to say that it was in 1982. So Carol Ann Duffy, born in 1955 in Glasgow, Scotland, and still going strong. She normally writes about topics such as gender and oppression, so writing about war is a little bit different for her, although this is not the only poem she's written about war. She has written a few, maybe three or four, and she uses familiar conversational language in her poetry. In 2009, she became the first woman and the first openly bisexual person to become poet laureate. I mean, this is not relevant to the poem, but it's interesting to know. She lived in Glasgow, Scotland until the age of 6 before moving to Stafford, England with her family. And she started writing poetry at the age of 14. Okay, so as always, here is a glossary for the poem. And as you can see, not many words because she doesn't use difficult words. And here are the techniques that she uses. So quite a lot of techniques. So please pause the video here and try to learn these words, or at least read through them 2 or 3 times. So the poem is easier to understand. In particular, spool. So notice this is how photographs used to be made in the old days before smartphones came along. And weekly supplements are magazines that come with the Sunday papers. I mean, again, newspapers, physical newspapers are dying out as well. And the reason why I've done this like this is actually a quote from the poem, okay? But I didn't put the speech marks around it. So these are cities around the world where there has been war. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So let's listen to the poem and then we'll go through it.
In his dark room he's finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something's happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyebrows prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns a living, and they do not care.
Okay, so let's go through the poem now. So this is about a war photographer, okay? So he's gone out, he's taken some photos, and he's come back, and he's now developing the photos. So he's in his dark room. So as I say, the way photos are taken has changed. So in the old days, they would be taken on film, and that film had to be developed in a dark room. So there he is. Okay. I mean, this is just a random picture from the internet. And in this line here, very interesting line, we've got personification, we've got alliteration, and we've also got juxtaposition, because on the one hand, we've got the suffering, but on the other hand, we've got these ordered rows. Okay. And then the only right light is red. So you have to have red light, and the other light would develop the photos improperly. Okay. I mean, we don't need to understand exactly how the photographic process works. And actually, in this line, we've also got a bit of a juxtaposition, but it's a bit more subtle, a bit more difficult to spot. So on the one hand, we've got the red light and the connotations of red being danger and death. But on the other hand, it's softly glowing. Okay, so there's a bit of juxtaposition there as well. And then here we have a simile as though this were a church, all right? And he is a priest. So obviously he's a war photographer, but connotations there, how seriously he takes his job. He almost feels it to be like a religious calling, preparing to intone a mass. So this means to chant, and this is a Catholic ritual. Okay. And then here we have a list of 3 cities or countries, well, cities. And this is Northern Ireland, this is Lebanon, this is Cambodia, and these are all places where there has been war. And then this line is interesting in many ways. Number one, it's a short sentence, and he uses quite a lot of short sentence. Sorry, she uses quite a lot of short sentences. I said he because of the photographer. And this is a reference to the Bible also, so as well as being a short sentence. Now, interesting, isn't it? So we've got the reference to the Bible, we've got the Mass here, we've got the priest. And one thing I should have possibly mentioned in the biography actually is that she was born and raised as a Catholic, although she became an atheist at the age of 15. But she says that her Catholic Christian upbringing had a big influence on her, and you can see that in her poetry. She even says that poetry and prayer are kind of similar. And basically, what this means is that in the same way that we cut grass every week or whatever, it's a bit like human life that people are born, they grow up and they die, and then the next generation is born and it dies. So she's kind of making that reference to the fact that life is temporary, it's not permanent. Okay. And then she says he has a job to do, and that's fairly straightforward. Another short sentence. And these solutions are the solutions used to develop the film. Slop means to kind of slap around the water, right? Moving around in trays. And his hands are trembling, which is really strange because when he was in the war zone taking the photos, they didn't tremble, but now they're trembling. So why do you think that is? Maybe because in the war, the adrenaline was flowing. He didn't have time to think. All right. Whereas now he has time to think, and he's probably in his mind going through the terrible scenes that he saw, and that's what's making his hands tremble, and also the serious nature of his duty as a war photographer. Okay, so they're trembling now. Here's another short sentence. So rural means countryside. So there's rural England, peaceful, unlike the war zones that he goes to. So he's come home again. And here, yes, people have problems, they have a bit of pain, but it's ordinary pain. It's small problems, small pain. Might be a cold, little bit of ache and pain, and a little bit of sunshine can sort it out. Unlike in those war zones. And he's now these lines, we don't know exactly what they're referring to. He's maybe thinking about various places he's been to where there are bombs and landmines. This line people have suggested could be a reference to a little young girl who was running. There's a famous photograph of her running in Vietnam when the country was bombed by napalm, by chemicals, by the Americans, and all her clothes had been torn off. Something is happening. So another short sentence, and this is the person whose photo he took, the person who died, and the photo is developing. And here the half-formed ghost, I mean, that's both metaphorical and literal. It's obviously metaphorical because it's not a ghost, but it's sort of literal in the sense that in the photo here, you can see it kind of looks like a ghost. And so the man's wife was crying, and the photographer, he kind of looked at her without words and asked for permission to take the photo of this dying man. And that's an interesting question you can think about later on for the higher grades. Should these photographs even be taken? Should they be shown? But from his point of view, he feels that somebody has to take these photos so that people can see what's going on. And then this one here, this line is a bit strange because so he's talking about the blood of this man staining the ground where he was, but he says foreign dust, but surely, yes, it was foreign to the photographer, but surely for the man, it wasn't foreign, it was his country. So anyway, that's something to think about. And then 100 agonies, he means he's taken 100 photographs. It probably doesn't literally mean exactly 100, but he's taken loads of photographs. And I mean, the black and white could either be literal, that they're black and white photographs, or it could be black and white in the sense that on the film, it's always looks black and white, but obviously when you develop it, it can either be black and white or color. And out of these 100 photographs, the editor will pick out 5 or 6 for the magazine that goes with the Sunday newspaper. And then this is interesting, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears. So that here, prick means like a tiny bit of pain or a small amount. And that's very, but this does have connotations of pain, right? But it's interesting that not only in the sense that they're only going to cry for a few seconds, but also the point being they only feel the pain for a few seconds, as opposed to this man who died, his wife who's going to feel the pain forever, right, until she dies, right? And the readers are just going to feel a bit of pain. So they'll get up in the morning, they'll have their bath, they'll read their papers, feel a bit of emotional pain, and then they'll have their a beer, and then they'll have their lunch. Now these last 2 lines are confusing because there's like a big jump, isn't there? So we can assume here that he's now back on his plane, going away to the next war zone to do his job. And this means to look down without feeling. But I think this doesn't mean that he doesn't feel. It's more like he's kind of like so used to this job now and also used to the fact that nobody really cares. He's had to deaden himself to the pain. All right. So he's gone back to where he earns his living by taking these photographs and selling these photographs. And he's saying they don't care, that nobody really cares. But the point about these 2 lines, you would have thought they should be in a separate stanza. So you might want to think about why the poet, doesn't do that. Maybe it's to retain this structure of 6 lines in each of these 4 stanzas. Okay. Okay, so AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. So loads of quotes there that you can choose from. You only need about 4 to 6 quotes. Here's all the techniques. So please pause the video and make sure that you understand these connections. And I'm going to move on. So AO2, language, form, and structure using techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases and their effects, thoughts, feelings, images, connotations, alternative suggestions. So we talked about the word red and and so there's a few examples there from the previous slide. And in terms of form and structure, the poem is not of a specific form. It doesn't have a rhythm scheme, but there is a rhyme scheme, and we'll look at that later. There are 4 stanzas of 6 lines each, perhaps matching the ordered rows of film spools. And most of the poem is set in the darkroom, but the last two lines are on the plane. And as I mentioned, these last two lines feel like they should be separate, but perhaps they were kept together so as to preserve the overall physical structure, this structure of four stanzas of 6 lines each. And then techniques and terminology. Duffy uses many techniques, but especially juxtaposition and short sentences, as well as everyday language. And some good points to make about context here are as follows. The fact that war is an unusual topic for Duffy, and the possible connection to the Falklands War and the other war zones mentioned. And actually, I should have probably put this here, the fact about her religious upbringing, but then she became an atheist, but you can see that religious influence in her poetry. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. If you really struggle, you need to go back and listen again. I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So here are the answers. Please pause the video here and check your answers. If you're far out, you need to go back and try again. You're aiming for at least 50%, but really 70, 90, 100%. And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. And I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. So you might get a question like this. How does the poet present attitudes to war in War Photographer? Compare with one other poem in the anthology. So we're not going to do that, but you could compare with Remains. So there, the effect on the soldier of shooting those bank robbers, or here, so in terms of about this poem in terms of the effects of conflict, here kamikaze is maybe, in terms of this question, certainly is maybe a better comparison. The attitudes to war in kamikaze, the difference between the kamikaze pilot and his family, all right, matches quite nicely with the difference between the public in this poem and the photographer. Okay, so that's quite so. Your comparison, I mean, on the one hand, you need to know which poem you're going to compare with, okay, but you should possibly have one or two options in mind because you might want to choose the poem depending on the question, you see. Okay, so if the question is about the effects of conflict, then I think maybe Remains. But if it was this question, then I think Kamikaze makes a better comparison. Or Exposure, again, the difference between the attitude of the poet in Exposure of Wilfred Owen and the people back home. Okay, so this poem is quite interesting. You can compare it to quite a few other poems. There isn't just one obvious one that you could compare with. And then you might start something like this. The poet presents attitudes to war by describing how a war photographer risks his life to document the terrible nature of war, but most people don't really care. She uses techniques such as juxtaposition to do this. The poem begins with the juxtaposition, spools of suffering in ordered rows. The first quote also has personification and alliteration. All of these techniques serve to highlight the difference in attitude between the photographer and the public. So about 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion with a bit of context, would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. If you're aiming higher, we can carry on. Okay, so let's look at the poem again for these items here. So in terms of tone and mood, I think we can agree there is a very serious, solemn, almost religious tone. And the mood created is also similar. And I think most readers would agree with the poem about the difference in attitude between people and between the general public and people like the war photographer who actually see this up close. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, so alone, rose, glows, he, mass, grass. So we can see here rose and glows rhymes. Mass and grass sort of rhyme. And then praise, then again, dispel, feed, heat. So we've got these two rhyme, then and again sort of rhyme, and then features, eyes, cries, approval, must, dust. So eyes and cries. So you have got, there is a rhyme scheme, these rhyming couplets, okay, although it seems to break down sometimes, which obviously might mirror the difference in attitude between the photographer and the general public. And white, six, prick, bears, wear, care. So again here, six and prick sort of rhyme, but not quite. And these two. So you've got these kind of pairs of rhyming couplets, but at the same time, a slight breakdown in the rhyming scheme. Without even counting the syllables, you can see that the rhythm itself is not regular. You can see how all the lines are different lengths. I mean, they're sort of similar. They're not hugely different, but they're not very similar either. So there isn't quite a rhythm scheme, which again could match. In other words, the fact that the war photographer and the public are out of rhythm with each other. Now, in terms of language, form, and structure and context, in terms of language, there aren't really any words or phrases that you can really analyze deeply, because the whole point being that this poet, Ann Duffy, she believes in using everyday language, but at a high level or in terms of metaphors and allusions. So you could think about this one, you could talk about the connections to religion and talking about context again, about how she was born and raised a Catholic, became an atheist, but you can see clearly how the Catholic upbringing did affect her poetry, and she has said that. And then in terms of form and structure, we've talked about the rhyme and rhythm, and there's four stanzas of 6 lines each, and you may want to think about or discuss in your writing why these 2 lines are part of this stanza. Why are they not separate? Okay, so and we mentioned earlier it could be that she wanted to keep the 6 lines for each stanza. Okay, so those are some of the things you can think about in terms of the higher grades. So advanced quiz, please pause the video here and have a think about these questions and make sure you write some things down. So I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So please pause the video and check your answers. Here it's not about getting it exactly the same, but just notice here I've added this bit about her being born and raised a Catholic and its influence on her poetry. So please make sure you read through these answers, and even if they're not the same as what you've got, take this opportunity now to learn from this slide. So moving on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So you have now learned more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. So up to here is the same as before. And then I've written here, or I've added, Duffy normally writes about things like gender, but this poem was written in 1985, a few years after the Falklands War, when the war was still fresh in people's minds. This may have prompted her to write a poem about war, and indeed she has written other poems about war also. Now, in terms of grade 8 or 9, so like I said, not going to be so much about the words and phrases in themselves, but certainly this line there's a lot of material there for a high grade student. If you can pick out the fact that there are so many techniques here, the alliteration, the personification, the juxtaposition, and also the more subtle juxtaposition here between red and softly, and the references to the Bible and so on. And there you could then link to her Catholic upbringing, and that would also then tie into context as well. And you might want to discuss, should such photos be taken and shown? You could talk about the structural effect of those last 2 lines. I think that, depending on how you go about that, that would be a high grade thing to do. And you might just want to briefly research these three cities here. You don't need too much, okay? Just a few sentences But if you're a high grade student, you'll be the sort of student who wants to find out these kind of things out of interest anyway. And then once you've done all that, you could complete the essay we started. How does the poet present attitudes to war in War Photographer? Okay, so that's that. I hope you found that video useful. And if so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.